Good afternoon and welcome to the Faculty Staff Town Hall sponsored by Penn State Today and the University Staff Advisory Council. Today we will be discussing the results from the latest Penn State Values and Culture Survey. Students, faculty, and staff participated in the survey in October. The results were released in May, and now university leaders would like to hear if you have any questions. We've been soliciting those questions for a few weeks now, but you can still submit them either written on paper and passed down to the end of the aisles, emailed to questions@psu.edu, or in the Google form that you can find at liveevents.psu.edu. Questions may be combined or condensed for time purposes or if we receive similar submissions, but I will retain the heart of the questions we receive. We are streaming this town hall live again at liveevents.psu.edu for all of our campuses to view. And because we are taking questions from our streaming audience as well as our in-person audience, it's very important that everyone follow the question procedure. Answering your questions today will be Executive Vice President and Provost Nick Jones, Senior Vice President for Finance and Business David Gray, and University Ethics Officer Tim Balliette. We've asked each of them to say a few words and then we'll get right to your questions. David Gray, can we hear from you?
Sure, thank you, Ben. So the results from the fall 2017 survey, Values and Culture Survey, depicted that the university has made some noteworthy strides, at least in certain areas of importance. Among them are a higher level of awareness of our university's values, processes, and also reporting, where there are instances of wrongdoing that people are much more aware of the processes by which they can report and how to go about that reporting process. If there's one thing that I think is important to underscore coming out of that second survey, it's that everybody in this university community has an important role to play in improving the strength and fabric of that community of which they're a part. And as leaders, we're all committed to removing existing challenges and seeing that that cultural strength continues to just improve. And one, I think, very good example of that is the initiative that we launched 2 years ago in finance and business called the Taking Action Initiative. That was really an outgrowth of the first survey that was done in 2013, in which it was noted that there was a pronounced fear of retaliation when reporting wrongdoing among many of our staff in particular, and that fear seemed particularly strongly rooted in some of the divisions of units of finance and business. And as we dug into that issue further, what we determined was that the fear of retaliation wasn't so much a cause as it was a symptom, and that the underlying issues that bred that fear of retaliation were inadequate communications and a feeling or a lack of trust among our employees. And so what we have really paid a lot of attention to over the past 2 years in addressing this Taking Action initiative is trying to promote the idea of robust, respectful, and civil communications at all levels within finance and business, providing our supervisors with better tools and awareness of the importance of communication, because sometimes it's just as simple as employees, be they peers or involved in a supervisory relationship, simply not communicating adequately with those that they're expected to interact with each and every day. So building that more robust platform of communication, we think will lead to eventually that feeling of trust that we all would want and expect to have in this kind of community. And we're hard about that initiative, as I say, 2 years in. But what I have told folks in finance and business is not to expect overnight or miraculous results. This is a journey. It's a lengthy process. Building up that communication, building up those levels of trust is something that's going to take a long time. It's going to take persistence and dedication, and people will need to appreciate the fact that this is not just some fad that we're going through, but rather something that we are very seriously committed to for the long haul. So again, we really see a multi-year journey, and in the first 2 years, we are seeing some gradual signs of improvement, and I would like to think that as we continue and persist in that we will expect to see even better results when the next survey is taken some years from now. I would also point out that we're really piloting this within finance and business That fear of retaliation, the issues of trust and communication exist not only in finance and business, but across the university, and we would hope to apply the lessons learned from our Taking Action initiative in F&B to other areas once we harvest those lessons learned. So we're making progress, Ben, and I think the survey results speak to that.
Thank you very much. Now can we hear from Nick Jones?
Thanks, Ben. I, of course, would echo much of what David Gray just said, but just put a little spin on some of the aspects, perhaps. Certainly, first and foremost, our challenges have continued to evolve over time. I think we've learned a lot. We're much more aware of these issues and more sensitive to them than we have been before. And as David indicated, and you'll hear in a moment, I think we've made actually some pretty good progress. But much work obviously remains to be done in this space. I just wanted to speak to you all for a moment about the importance of you being willing to speak up. We need people to have the courage to do so. We know it's not always easy. When you see wrongdoing, it is easy just to look the other way and think that it is somebody else's problem or somebody else's responsibility to report. It's yours, and we really need you to have that courage. I would put this in the context of one of our 6 core values as an institution, and that's the value of community. If you observe misconduct or poor treatment of a fellow worker, it is likely that the perpetrator is not only acting inappropriately towards that individual, but potentially to others as well. If we're not calling people out for their behavior or reporting them in the extreme cases where there is clear misconduct, then we're not really embracing our institutional value of community. And I think that that's a really important consideration. We need to take our adherence to Penn State's core values very seriously. I suspect we'll get some questions about this later on in the session, which we welcome. When a report of misconduct is made, we do investigate, and we will investigate. The outcomes from those investigations are not always clear. They are not always obvious. But if an investigation has a finding, I can assure you that it is the practice of our institution to take appropriate action in that instance. Not every investigation leads to a finding. In some cases, when there is a finding and action is taken, it's done discreetly or confidentially, and so it may not be obvious to in some cases, the reporter that an action has taken place. But I can assure you, we investigate every complaint we get, every hotline report, and if there is action to be taken, we take it. The issue of retaliation is a very important one. We will protect you against retaliation. I probably don't need to equivocate on that issue at all. We will. Retaliation in and of itself is a form of misconduct, and just as other instances of misconduct are investigated, so too will be retaliation. We need you to know that we, the leadership of the institution and all levels below us, will have your back if you feel that you have been retaliated against simply by virtue of the fact that you reported misconduct or perceived misconduct. And so we want to be very clear about that. And finally, I would just say, in terms of the progress that we are making, we are an institution of imperfection. And we're imperfect in an imperfect town, in an imperfect state, in an imperfect nation, and an imperfect world. We've got a lot of work to do. It's not always easy, but I think we are committed at Penn State to take a leadership role in moving forward in this space. And we will protect you if you report misconduct or if you feel that you are retaliated against. Finally, I just want to take this opportunity to introduce a relatively new appointment at Penn State, and that is our new Associate Vice President for Affirmative Action, Suzanne Adair. So Suzanne, would you mind just standing for a moment and giving a little wave to the camera? So Suzanne was appointed last year. Suzanne replaced Ken Lehrman, who was Vice Provost for Affirmative Action. You'll notice that the title is different. The title is different on purpose because we want to convey very clearly to the broader university community that as Associate Vice President for Affirmative Action, Suzanne's purview is everything and everyone at the university, not just the academic side of the house. And so we're thrilled to have Suzanne on board at the helm of that office. In her new role, she will also have responsibility for all Title IX reporting across the university, and through me has a direct line to President Barron. So I just wanted to take that opportunity to introduce Suzanne. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, and we'd also like to ask Tim Balliet to summarize the results of the survey, if he could.
Thank you, Ben. So the Values and Culture Survey, as was mentioned, was held in October of this past year, and it was a follow-up from our previous survey in 2013. So first I'd like to just review some of the initiatives that took place here at the university following the last survey. Perhaps one of the strongest is the development here at Penn State of becoming a national model really for ethics and compliance programs throughout higher education. The staff, not only in the Office of Ethics and Compliance, but throughout the university, are really now looked to by our peers as experts in a variety of different areas. And that, I think, is a testament to the leadership at Penn State and the support of that function. The Penn State values developed out of the 2013 survey. In addition to the survey results, we also had town halls throughout the university, and from that organically grew the statement of our 6 core values. We also tried to simplify the reporting process when you do or proceed to encounter misconduct. We had a variety of ways in which to report misconduct, over 23, I believe, at the time, and that was very confusing. So we tried to simplify that as much as possible, including the Penn State hotline. We also established the Office of Sexual Misconduct Prevention and Response, which is now within the Associate Vice President of Affirmative Action's purview. And we've also, as an approach to deal with some of the more prevalent misconduct, and to speak of our ethical expectations for staff members, we've incorporated ethics and compliance statements within the annual performance review, including within the core competencies that our employees have. We've created many different training opportunities here at the university. Most are probably most familiar with the annual compliance training, but we also have a variety of other compliance trainings and indeed ethics-related trainings and ethical decision-making trainings. So those all came out of the awareness that we needed to focus more on this. And speaking of awareness, a number of different awareness programs around different types of misconduct. We also have an increase in regular communication from leadership. We saw that there was concern, similar as we saw in finance and business, about a lack of transparency, a lack of trust. And so one of the initiatives, quite clearly, is our town hall meetings that we have here today, among a variety of different ways, letters from leadership, direct communication, and the like. And finally, we've created and revised a number of different policies related to ethics and to misconduct. Perhaps one of the most noticeable, the Code of Responsible Conduct, which clearly articulates what our expectations and responsibilities are as employees across the university, and our revised general standards of professional ethics for our faculty as well. Those are just 2 among around 10 to 12 different new policies that we've had since that time. Now, we've been using the term misconduct for the last few minutes, and so I just wanted to place some names to what we refer to there. On the slide are the different types of misconduct that we ask questions about on the survey, and that are more frequent types of misconduct that we see here at the university. So everything from abusive, intimidating behavior to academic integrity violations, acts of bias and discrimination, substance abuse, and the like. So those who were participants in the survey asked if they had observed any of these types of misconduct in the last 12 months prior to taking the survey. The other kind of core definition to review would be what exactly is retaliation. There's a legal definition to it, but also by Penn State policy. What do we consider retaliation to be? In order for an event to have been retaliatory, the individual, as Dr. Jones had mentioned, needs to come forward first and report misconduct of some type. And then if the individual has experienced any type of adverse action as a result of having made that report of misconduct, then that's when retaliation has occurred. So oftentimes at the university, people speak of retaliation as having brought up an idea or made a decision, and then somebody, quote unquote, retaliated against them and having some action. The legal definition would not cover that type of activity. It's only when someone first comes forward, makes a report of misconduct, participates in a court hearing or investigation. So on the slide are a number of different types of retaliation, and some of the more common ones, unfortunately, that we've seen here at the university and at other similar workplaces. I did want to just reiterate what Dr. Jones said. We do take reports of retaliation very seriously. They are investigated, and it does result in disciplinary action if it's substantiated. So in terms of some of the strengths that we found in this most recent survey, one of the most important and pleasing to us was the increased awareness of resources for employees and for students about where to report, how to report, where to turn to for help or assistance and the like. And that awareness increased threefold for faculty and doubled for staff. So that was very, very good to see. We also saw an increased rate of reporting misconduct across all of our groups here at the university. That points to that our awareness programs and some of our training have been fruitful. So that was another positive step. And we'll take a little more, a deeper look at that in a few slides. What was particularly pleasing too was the knowledge of the Penn State values. They're only about 2 to 3 years old, if you will, in their formal conception, and yet well over 85% of those here at the university were aware of them and saw them at play, enculturated in their work units, their colleges, and the like. So that was very pleasing. I think it speaks to the organic nature that those values originated from. And then finally, a very strong connection to the university. At least 97% of Penn Staters, employees and students, have at least a moderate, if not strong, connection to the university. And that's unheard of in organizations of our size across the United States and globally. So, as Dr. Jones mentioned, that essence and sense of community is really something that defines us and is one of our core values, certainly. So now let's get to some of the, if you will, more concerned areas. We look at observed misconduct. Between 2013 and 2017, we saw a slight increase among our faculty and staff and graduate students in observed misconduct. Typically, we see that increase after the development and promulgation of awareness programs and of training. People have become more sensitized and aware of certain actions that now really do constitute misconduct. So based on the research and based on what we've seen, this is not wholly unexpected to see a slight increase in observed misconduct. The most commonly observed misconduct here at Penn State among our faculty and staff are abusive and intimidating behavior, unfortunately. About a third to slightly 40% have observed that in here, as well as acts of bias and discrimination. About a third of our faculty and staff have observed that. If we look to student-related misconduct, academic integrity violations are unfortunately our leading misconduct, about a third of students, as well as student substance abuse, both drugs and alcohol abuse as well. So those are our most commonly observed misconducts. And what we learned this time, we added some questions to get at the nature of where this is occurring and who may be alleged perpetrators. And we found that the vast majority of misconduct was taking place within one's unit or college of what they're observing. The only exception to that are undergraduate students. Most of the misconduct that they're observing is taking place off campus. which creates a new dynamic for us in order how to best address and deal with. So what does this all mean? As I mentioned, this is common to see this slight increase after implementation of programs in education. And this is also, for us, a sign that we're moving in the right direction. Okay. In terms of where we stand relative to other organizations, unfortunately, within higher education, we're the only institution to take such an extensive look at our culture and our workplace. And so there are no other institutions that we can benchmark with. But if we look at the staff side in particular, when we look at organizations of our size, around 50% of employees observe some act of misconduct. So our numbers are not that significantly larger than what we see. Excuse me. In terms of reporting misconduct, we did see an increase, and this is significant for us, again, because we're moving that culture in the right direction. We found out this year that where people are reporting most frequently is the individual to whom they have the most direct supervisory relationship with. So, for instance, faculty and staff, about 40 to 47% of the time report to their direct supervisor, whether it be a department head or otherwise. Graduate students report to the person they report to most frequently, whether that's their faculty advisor or someone with whom they're working on their assistantship. Similarly, with undergraduates, they turn to a faculty member most frequently to report their type of misconduct. So this really highlights the critical role that supervisors and faculty play in addressing allegations of misconduct. Certainly people are using the resources we've developed for different offices, but they truly are the front line. And so we need to be able to provide tools and resources for them in order to how best to handle that and when and where to take that to other offices. So education and training are really the key focus, and that's one area that we'll be moving forward in. Excuse me. So as Dr. Jones mentioned, really increasing the comfort level that people have in reporting, knowing how the reporting process takes place, what to expect, is going to be vital moving forward to help drive this metric even higher. Again, as an international and national comparison, organizations of our size typically would be about 69% of employees report misconduct. So for staff, we're still below where we would like to be relative to other organizations. Now, with respect to the Penn State hotline, since we're speaking of reporting, I did just want to highlight a few metrics that illustrate that we do take these issues quite seriously. Excuse me. So reports of misconduct to the Penn State hotline have increased by 230% since our office, the Office of Ethics and Compliance, was created. And we're very pleased that people are trusting that as an avenue and revenue or option to report. As an idea of what happens, we had about 357 reports last year. Of those, 38% after we did the investigation were determined to be unfounded, or we simply were not able to have enough or sufficient evidence to make a firm conclusion related to that. About 30% did result in some type of appropriate action that was taken. And so that metric really demonstrates that we do take this seriously. Unfortunately, about 20%, particularly with anonymous reporters, do not provide enough information for us to initiate an investigation. In our hotline, we do have an opportunity for our office to post back questions for more information. And when someone makes a report to the hotline, they're given a confidential code that only they have, that we do not have. And so even if you report anonymously, you can go back into the system and check if we have additional questions so that we can pursue that investigation. It's also a means by which we communicate what the end result or outcome was as well, to be transparent. About 10% were referred to another investigatory office or to an external one. And then currently, right now, 5% are still under review, investigation. Those are more lengthy ones, or people actually withdrew the report itself. So if you have any concerns about misconduct, certainly you can use our hotline. You can find the number at hotline.psu.edu. We also have a number of reporting resources at reporting.psu.edu. So heading forward, what are some areas of increased focus for us? We're really, or at least I am from my chair, as well as leadership, about the increases in observed abusive, intimidating behavior and acts of bias and discrimination. I think relative to the awareness campaigns, our All In initiative last year, and that continues, I think has brought a lot of awareness to be able to identify acts of bias and discrimination much more clearly. So now that we've increased that awareness, the next step is how do we address that? And what steps do we do to combat that, if you will? Similar with abuse and intimidating behavior. How can we identify it and how can we mitigate that? In terms of retaliation, we still have a significant fear of retaliation. About only 42 to 44% of our employees think that the university does not retaliate. So we have a majority of our employees are either uncertain or think that the university actually retaliates, or employees do, against those who report. And that's a metric we're certainly not comfortable with. And that speaks to the degree of trust that we want to and need to build. In terms of the actual rate of retaliation for employees, it's around 11 to 18%, which is far lower than the national average. For the last 10 years, it's been around 20%, and in the most recent metrics, has doubled in the last 3 years to 40%. So given that we've seen increase in observed misconduct, increase in reporting, and that our rates of retaliation, relatively speaking, are low, is actually a positive. However, it's still too high, in my opinion. That 11 to 18% of individuals who do report perceive that they're being retaliated against. We can never get that number to zero. In the research, kind of the goal is always around 5%, because people will perceive retaliation, and there are bad actors that we need to work with and on. But we're still room for growth and room for improvement there. Satisfaction with the reporting process, not uncommon for it to decline after an awareness campaign. People have higher expectations, but we haven't done a good enough job in explaining what to expect from the reporting process. So we have some definite room for growth there. And finally, as I alluded to, undergraduate misconduct is occurring mostly off campus. And so we need to shift some of our strategies to address that. I want to give particular mention to the wonderful work that our Office of Student Affairs is doing in mitigating the Greek life issues and concerns. And we're seeing very positive, demonstrable evidence that we're moving in the right direction. Also, our bystander intervention program has shown a dramatic impact in students feeling comfortable to step forward when they see misconduct occurring off campus. So this is where we will focus our next couple of years of trying to address those areas of concern. How will we do that? So in terms of moving forward, we will maintain our commitment to and enhance the changes that we've made since 2013. We're now beginning momentum moving forward, and just as David had mentioned, that this takes time. Culture change is like moving the Titanic. It takes usually about 7 to 10 years, based on the research, to see this shift. So we're moving that direction. We want to develop an anti-retaliation program, modeled on some of the best models across the United States. We want to have a better understanding of the context under which and how retaliation is happening, how we can better protect people who do make reports of misconduct, and how we can better protect them and have check-ins and means of addressing some of those issues. There's some technological opportunities there now with Workday. We're still exploring, but we'll continue with that. We're going to be revising our supervisory training, both for faculty and for staff, so that they're better prepared how to deal with misconduct when it occurs, how to identify it in the workplace, and how to be transparent and how to build trust related to that. And so similarly for all employees, we'll be revising our awareness and educational campaigns to address some of these concerns. And finally, much like what we're doing today, we will continue to keep the community informed. We want to be transparent. We want to be able to help build and establish trust. And the only way to do that is to keep an open and sharing and honest dialogue.
Thank you all very much. We're going to start our question and answer period now. And even though you alluded to it in the beginning with your opening statement, this has been a question we've received numerous times. But why does it seem like reports of wrongdoing go unaddressed? And is there some mechanism to report about an issue without violating those confidential reasons?
Perhaps I can take this one because I addressed it in my opening remarks. It's hard to say why that perception exists, except perhaps to look at some of the data that Tim just shared, which show that, for example, with hotline complaints, that about a third of them result in an actionable finding and that action is taken, which means that 2/3 of the hotline complaints, for whatever reason, don't necessarily end up with some kind of actionable or necessarily visible outcome. Of the 1/3 that do, a good portion of them may be relatively discreet or subtle and not obvious to the person perhaps who filed the original complaint. So it's actually fairly easy for me to imagine that that folks may interpret from those numbers that if they're one of the 2/3 or even one of the third but didn't see anything explicit or obvious that was done in response to their complaint, that they may perceive that nothing happens. I would just reiterate my comments in my opening remarks, and that is, we investigate every hotline complaint. We investigate every complaint that we receive to the best of our ability. As Tim indicated, sometimes we simply don't have enough information to go on, but we investigate every complaint, every report of misconduct, including retaliation, to the best of our ability. And if there is a finding and an action to be taken, we will proceed accordingly and do that. So I just want to assure everybody who is participating or listening that we take reports of misconduct, every single one, very seriously.
You had mentioned in your opening statement that most of people's point of contact is their direct supervisor. What mechanisms exist to go beyond that supervisor, and is there an issue with trust that people aren't willing to go beyond that right now?
Let me take a crack at that, Ben. Yes, there are avenues beyond one's direct supervisor that staff or faculty can rely upon, or students. You can certainly go to your HR strategic partner for your academic unit or the support unit that you're a part of. You can go directly to the Office of Ethics and Compliance. You can go to the office, depending upon the nature of the issue, you can go to the Office of Employee and Labor Relations within our Central Human Resources Office. So there are numerous, if it's a case of bias, as we've already mentioned, you can go to the Associate Vice President for Affirmative Action. So there are a number of different outlets or sources where an individual can go to lodge a concern about misconduct if they are not comfortable for whatever reason in reporting that directly to their supervisor.
And what would you say to a person who is asking, convince me that these anonymous mechanisms are truly anonymous?
Well, I suppose to some degree they have to take us at our word that we absolutely uphold the processes that Tim outlined in his opening remarks are designed very much to protect the anonymity of reporters who report through the hotline. Obviously, that's probably the most direct and easy way for employees to make a confidential report and have their anonymity absolutely assured. They, as I say, will have to have some basic degree of trust that we as a university administration are very sincere about guarding and protecting the anonymity, because it is in all of our collective interest to preserve that confidentiality and that anonymity so that we're creating a climate where people are not fearful of bringing forward reports of misconduct. There's just, I think, a degree of earnestness there in what we're attempting to do that I would hope that people would place a little bit of basic trust in Dr. Barron, Nick, myself, and others, that when we say this, we genuinely mean that we will protect the anonymity of those who report.
If I could add just one quick follow-up to that. Sometimes I know people have concern in the anonymity department because they are reporting a specific incident. They're not obviously in an anonymous hotline telling folks their name and contact information, but sometimes the nature of the report is sufficiently specific that they could be concerned that regardless of whether they give their name or not, someone is going to figure out who it was. This is a reasonable concern, but I can just reiterate David's comments. It really doesn't matter. We don't play that guessing game. If there is a report of misconduct, we worry less about who the reporter was than we do about addressing the misconduct that was alleged. So that, I can assure you, is the focus, and this is never a matter of, even actually in the sometimes difficult situations for us where we have a lot of important information but not quite enough, and would just, even though we suspect because of the nature of the allegation who the person might be, we still respect the anonymity of the process, and if we solicit more information, it is through the mechanism that Tim described before with the passcode thing.
Sure. If I may, just some examples of how we keep that anonymity. The hotline is not run by Penn State, it's run by Navex Global, which is a third party, the largest actually internationally that deals with hotlines. So when you contact them, all the identifying information is stripped. So even IP addresses, phone numbers, what have you, we don't receive any of that. And the individual makes the decision whether to be anonymous or not. And the contact information that the individual reporting receives, the university does not receive. So the passcode and the like. So there's no way for us to go back into the system to find out who that might be. But our transparency with the anonymous reporter is through that mechanism. So if we have additional questions, if we need to provide an update, it's all done that way to protect specifically the anonymity of the report. So my apologies, I just wanted to share something.
Is there any sort of advice or any resource to do a self-check if I feel I'm being retaliated against? You had mentioned in the definitions, maybe it's not. Maybe I just didn't earn that next step in promotion, but I feel like I've been retaliated against. Is there a way to check myself before moving on to a report? Or advice?
If I may, I would say that a couple of things that you could do. First, as you said, just kind of look at whether there's anything that could possibly explain what you're seeing. You know, if the example that you gave is my performance evaluation lower, is there true demonstrable evidence that I truly haven't done better, that my supervisor's been able to show or to bring? Certainly asking if you're comfortable, other employees that can give a good, honest appraisal of what they're seeing. But always, our office, the Office of Ethics Compliance, is always a place to turn if you have concerns that you may be retaliated against. And we can talk through and walk through that process, and as necessary, open an investigation related to that. One of the challenges is because of the sensitivity of making a report of misconduct, and to some degree the fear involved with that, people can become, if you will, a little oversensitive to everything that happens in the workplace. Because of that, it took a lot of courage to step forward and do that. And they may be concerned about it, looking for how changes may have taken place in the workplace and the like. And so sometimes it's helpful just to have somebody to kind of walk through and talk through some of those issues. Our office does that frequently for people.
In addition, I would only add they could also seek out their unit's HR strategic partner. That person is obligated by the nature of their role to act in a confidential fashion, to be a listening ear and also an advisor to an employee who feels that perhaps their supervisor or someone in their supervisory chain may have inappropriately evaluated their performance or acted wrongly in some other way.
Two others I would add. One is, of course, the Office of Affirmative Action if the individual feels that he or she is being discriminated against as a result of an action he or she has taken. And the other, depending on the circumstance, is to have a conversation with the college or the university ombudsperson, who is a designated neutral party who can just be an ear if you want to describe the circumstances that you're experiencing, and just seek counsel as to whether what you perceive to be happening sounds legitimate, and get suggestions on how to proceed.
Thank you. We've received a couple of questions related to this topic, and much has been written about it in academia about the power differential between faculty and staff, and what's being done to address that.
I guess that's my one. Well, it's real. In an institution like in any organization, there are power differentials across personnel structures. Universities are special in that we have staff and we have faculty, and there are perceived power differentials between those two groups as well as within them. At the risk of appearing to be trite, I would say it doesn't matter if there is a power differential is a power differential, or a perceived power differential is a perceived power differential. It doesn't matter if it's a faculty member who is you consider to be higher on the power ladder, or a staff person whom you perceive to be higher. Misconduct is misconduct, and if you either observe or are a victim of some type of misconduct, you should report. You can report. There are many mechanisms to report. From our perspective, if this leads to an investigation, whether the perpetrator is a faculty member or a more senior member of the staff, or a staff peer or a faculty peer, it really doesn't matter to us. Misconduct is misconduct. We will investigate it, and if there was a finding, we will take appropriate action.
If I can dovetail off that appropriate action, we just had a question come in from the audience, and can you tell us about the range, again, without going into specifics, but what are the results when it's determined that something wrong was done? What can happen to a person? Can you share some sort of range there?
Well, I think the range is fairly wide by design. It can include anything from an appropriate reflection in that individual's performance evaluation, all the way up to, if it's serious enough, up to and including dismissal from university employment, and virtually everything in between those two extremes. So obviously we're very measured about that process. We wait for the appropriate investigation to conclude, and then meter the response to the behavior, really, Ben. But as I say, it can be range from relatively mild sanctioning all the way up to and including dismissal from employment.
And that includes, to David's point, both staff and faculty. And in fact, we have had instances of faculty misconduct that have ultimately led to their dismissal from the university as well. So it's worth adding in the context of the previous question about the power differential. Misconduct is misconduct, and we will deal with it appropriately.
Thank you. In your summary of the survey results, you mentioned some new training for supervisors pertaining to anti-retaliation. Can you tell us more about what that will look like and if it will be mandatory?
Well, currently we have several supervisory educational opportunities through the Office of Human Resources and others. There are a number of supervisory and management series, and within those, there's always a seminar, usually, honestly, probably about 3 hours, if I recall, for each, that really speaks about workplace culture, and when receiving a report of misconduct, how to best address that. What are ways to help instill trust, help build communication, how to triage it, if you will, and escalate as needed. And how to address the types of misconduct that we're seeing that are more under the supervisor purview, abusive, intimidating behavior, how to create that climate that's less discriminatory, and the like. In terms of requirements, for all new supervisors, We are looking at a required supervisory training, whether you're a new supervisor to Penn State or have moved up through the ranks within Penn State. There are discussions as to whether that should be required for current and existing supervisors. That hasn't been determined, particularly how that would be rolled out, timeline for rolling that out. But moving forward, definitely within the next year, we're looking at all new supervisors would have that training.
And we're piloting that idea right now within finance and business, Ben. And again, we'll assess the results of that pilot process, and based upon that, we may indeed roll it out for all new supervisors across the university.
Thank you. We had a question in from the audience that asked about the sort of difficult to clarify and quantify retaliation. They feel like people are talking about them behind their back. There's a sort of he said, she said going on. And what can the university do about this when it's hard to demonstrate any tangible things?
That might fall more into the category of social retaliation or actions that are taken, words that are spoken to damage a person's reputation. And that is considered by us to be retaliation. And retaliation in any form is not something that this university tolerates. It's a direct violation of university policy, and again, once a claim is substantiated, we will take action to address that form of retaliation as well.
Yeah, retaliation, I think, comes as some maybe here and some who are listening may have experienced. Retaliation comes in many forms and many flavors, but at the end of the day, it's retaliation, and retaliation is misconduct, and we do not tolerate it in any form.
Thank you. What is the university doing to let people know about these resources, aside from today?
Well, in our annual compliance training, we're revamping certain segments of that to make sure that we have better increased awareness of the hotline, how it works, and also some of the results that we found and why we're moving forward the way that we are. The supervisory training, some of our new employee orientation training also addresses some of these avenues and results. I personally will be sharing unit-specific reports. ECI, which is the firm that did our survey, is producing reports for all colleges, campuses, and support units. And so I will be meeting with the leadership of each of those with their results and develop a communication plan for each of those so that we can share the results more broadly, and areas that we could move forward with, tweak, and address based on what the concerns and the issues are within each of those, campus, college, or unit, as the case may be.
And I would just add, it's interesting as we are dissecting with Tim's help the results within finance and business, where we have several larger units like the Office of Physical Plan or the Auxiliary and Business Services organization. Actually, we can stratify them by a number of different subunits within, and oftentimes what we see are results from the survey that are at substantial variance from what the university overall averages are. And so sharing those results with our unit leaders is, I think, for them incredibly important, for them to be able to customize responses to their kind of local conditions, which, as I say, sometimes can be at considerable variance to the overall results that we see.
I would add that almost immediately after the survey results came out, we took the opportunity to present a summary of the survey to President's Council, and then we certainly followed up on the academic side, having a presentation at the Academic Leadership Council, which is all the deans and chancellors and heads of the primary academic support units across the university, just to socialize these findings and let people know that we would be following up with them individually on some of the recommendations. And so I can assure you that from the top, President's Council, certainly on the academic side, from the deans and chancellors, as well as David's leadership team on the F&B side, there is an absolute commitment to maximizing the learning from this survey and putting some of the lessons that we are learning into practice post haste.
May I add to that as well? So just in terms of our Title IX space in an effort to make sure that we inform community, as folks can imagine, we continually assess how we're doing on that front. So including how we're doing with communication, whether folks know what our policies are, know what our procedures are, know what our resources are. We, in the last couple of months, have been doing some revisions to some of our policies and procedures, and we'll figure out the best way to make sure that folks know what those revisions are and what the resources are and what some of our restructuring has been. In addition, we will make an announcement within the next week or so about the university's new Title IX coordinator. So again, we also continue that effort to try to figure out the best way to make sure that we effectively communicate with all of the university community.
Thank you all. Someone who has clearly looked into the survey a little bit asked that it seems like there is, amongst certain segments, still a feeling that the university is too focused on athletics. And what can be done to really emphasize the research being done here and the academic side of things here at Penn State?
Well, I think as most of you know, it doesn't take me too much of a prod to get me talking about the tremendous accomplishments that go on across Penn State every day in the three pillars of any research university: research, our educational programs, and our service. And I think most of you have probably observed over the last several years under the leadership of Strategic Communications, we've been much more active and thoughtful in ensuring that the good stories that are there to be told about what this university is accomplishing are getting out there in the local media, in the regional media, and in the national media. So I actually think we've come a long way in the last several years in telling the breadth of the good stories about Penn State, which includes those three areas, as well as intercollegiate athletics and other areas. But I think that there is a real effort underway to ensure that the world outside of Penn State knows what we're about and where we're making a difference in the nation and the world.
If I may just to follow up on that, the questions looked at, did the person who responded to the survey perceive that we placed too much emphasis on athletics? And then if they responded yes, there was a follow-up question, do you think that's specific to Penn State? And very few thought it was specific to Penn State. They thought it was reflective more broadly of higher education as a whole. So I think that's that perception and how to share kind of our good stories academically and research and otherwise, I think is something that's much broader than what we see here at Penn State.
And I would just add, there are real stories to be told. I think some of you may have seen the report that came out last week, a study done by LinkedIn that showed that Penn State was the #2 producer of CEOs in the nation, second only to Stanford. That's a pretty extraordinary accomplishment by this institution. And who knew before there was LinkedIn that was us? So this is a really good Penn State story, and there are many, many more of those, and I think they will continue to come out in years to come.
So you're saying there's occasionally good news on social media? Here's a question from the audience, and they've said, acknowledging that in this process of looking into a claim, it's got to be difficult to find evidence to justify any allegations and to justify any conclusions. What can a person who is making this report do to make sure they're providing enough intelligence for you to act on?
Sure. So it's your basic who, what, when, where. Okay. So who, to the best of your knowledge, perpetrated it? What did you see? What did you experience? Where did it happen? Some brief general timeline as to when. Okay, we don't need the exact time or day necessarily, but within a certain time frame or time period. The more specific you can be, the more helpful, and that gives us somewhere to move forward with. Unfortunately, we've had statements where they name an employee and says this employee is abusive, period. And that doesn't help us. We don't know well, what does that look like? What's happening? Who is it occurring with or around? So that we can actually begin to do something tangible with that information.
The other thing that's worth adding to that is, and I recognize, let me preface this by saying I understand that what I'm about to suggest is not always possible and seldom ever easy. But to the extent that people have the courage to actually identify themselves in the reporting process and be more specific, those same protections that Nick and Tim and I have spoken to already this afternoon, we will apply to those who come forward and are willing to be more explicit in sharing their stories. We want to make sure that we also have that anonymous avenue for people to utilize when they don't feel safe in exposing themselves. But whenever possible, to the extent that a person is willing to really be more explicit, more specific, more forthcoming with the details, including potentially divulging their name and relying on the university's promise of protection, that is perhaps the best way, or one of the best ways of actually assuring that appropriate action can be taken in investigating that claim of wrongdoing.
There is, if I'm correct, as you indicated before, Tim, a mechanism within the anonymous hotline reporting structure. So we encourage people who submit a hotline report to check back sometime in the future, because when we get that report and begin to screen it and start an investigation, there may be some key pieces of information that were just inadvertently left out of the original report, and it is not unusual to go back using the passcode to the individual and ask for a little bit more information. And so if you're attentive to following up on any report that you have submitted, you can continue to be helpful, even if you are not continue to not reveal your identity. So that mechanism is also available, and we encourage folks to take advantage of it.
You mentioned in the opening summary that not a lot of, if not any, major universities are doing this. So how does Penn State benchmark itself when there is no real peer institution?
There's a couple avenues by which we do that, at least on the employee side, to start with. There's the National Business Ethics Survey and the Global Business Ethics Survey, which are also utilized by ECI, which was the nonprofit organization that we use. So the questions are actually identical to some degree. And so that allows us to look at other nonprofits, governmental agencies, and other organizations that would be most similar to ours when we look at
more mission-driven organizations.
Exactly. The others, on the student side, we do have a number of assessments that are nationally distributed, and we work with the Assessment Office and Student Affairs to look at those numbers along with others that we have to see how we are sitting in terms of the student space. We're currently working with a number of our peers to institute a shorter version of our survey to at least initially get it out so we can look at some of those key core metrics to see how we are gauged among our peers.
Sometimes it's lonely being a leader. If you are really, if we are taking steps in this space that others are not, so for a while we might be out there alone, and I think some of you may have seen last week there was or a couple of weeks ago, there was a consequence of that when the National Academy of Sciences reported on sexual harassment at institutions of higher ed, and they gave the example of Penn State and the University of Texas. At first blush, it would look like, oh, they're singling us out because we must be really bad. Well, they were singling us out because we were the only institutions to have had the courage to conduct these surveys and get some quantitative data from which we could learn and take actions to effect positive change. And so sometimes it's a little scary to go out, to sort of stick your neck out and be willing to take on, ask these difficult questions and get important feedback in order to make a difference.
As you meet with leaders from our peer institutions, would you tell them, this is really something that you could benefit from? We're getting some good data here.
I have done so. I meet regularly, a couple of times a year, with other chief business officers from our Big Ten peer group. And actually, just in our most recent meeting this past May in Wisconsin encouraged my peers to consider this kind of survey, utilizing a national partner such as ECI, because I think the wealth of information that they can potentially harvest from that is worth their consideration, worth spending a little bit of their resources. And I think as we've sadly discovered, the kinds of problems that can beset very large, complex academic organizations like Penn State are not unique to us. Others suffer from some of those same challenging circumstances, and people that from time to time misbehave in rather profound ways. And I think all of our peers could benefit from understanding their own institutional culture better, just in that kind of quest for continuous improvement. We can all really strive to improve our circumstances wherever we may find ourselves.
Thank you. We had a question come in about specific reporting jobs and responsibilities. Staff members are often tasked with looking after the financing and organizing the bills. If a staff member feels that someone is spending wastefully, does that rise to the level of making a complaint?
Well, I would say, from my perspective, absolutely. It may not be a complaint. It may be a disclosure or a notification. There's a spectrum of intents here. So if the person is doing this willfully and in a negligent way, then it could and should be most likely reported as misconduct. But this institution is serious about ensuring that our financial resources are invested wisely and prudently. And if there are instances where that is not being done, we need to hear about it.
Yeah. And instances like that can just as easily be reported through the hotline, or if it's a specific allegation of misuse of resources or fraudulent use of resources, that is also something that could be sent along to the Office of Internal Audit.
We've seen a couple of variations of this question where someone might point out what they feel is a low spot or someplace where we haven't done as well as we should, and that then inevitably follows, what are you doing to make changes here? So just in a broad sense, what is the university doing to improve upon the results that we've seen from these last two surveys?
Well, I don't want to beat the proverbial dead horse, but finance and business, as I mentioned at the outset, has really embraced this Taking Action initiative over the past 2 years, and is now at the point where we are literally driving it down and across the entire finance and business organization. All line supervisors have been trained through that process, and the improvements that we expect to see in communication and employee engagement are continuing to be set forth as goals and objectives. In fact, the Taking Action initiative, something that I mandated this past year, is that an individual objective be embedded in every every supervisor's performance evaluation who's part of the finance and business organization. So again, another sort of demonstration of tangible steps that we're taking to really try and drive this process and embed it within the culture of our organization here.
On the academic side, I alluded to this a few moments ago, but I'll say it again. I think we have a group of deans, chancellors, and leaders of academic support units who are just incredibly committed to this institution continuing to make improvements in this space. And I know this just in general from my conversations with them, but I've actually worked pretty closely with a number of deans over the last several years as we've worked our way through really very, very difficult issues that have arisen as a result of reports of misconduct that have come forward. And I can assure you that among that leadership, there is an absolute commitment for this institution to do better in this space.
Another question from the live audience, and very specific: who does the investigations when a report is made? And is that a different group for the Commonwealth campuses?
We have investigators within the Office of Ethics and Compliance that are trained professionals, and that is the primary locus of where we have that investigative capacity. Tim, you may want to add to that.
Sure. In certain investigations, such as affirmative action, sexual harassment, and the like, we have unique offices. Research misconduct, we have specific offices that are trained specialists that do that type of work. And then sometimes we do partner based on the nature of the misconduct with different offices and units throughout the university. So if reported through the hotline, the ultimate, if you will, ownership of that investigation is with the Office of Ethics and Compliance, and then we will partner with other offices as needed in order to continue that.
And a good example is the office, to the question that was raised before about something inappropriate in the financial space. The Office of Internal Audit is frequently, I think, called to the table to help do what we will generally term a forensic audit focused on a very specific issue or concern that has been raised to try to determine whether there is sort of evidence that supports that claim, and then make the appropriate reporting to the Office of Ethics and Compliance or whomever else.
The other situation, unfortunately, and on rare occasion, the misconduct will rise to a level of potential criminal wrongdoing, in which case we engage the police immediately.
Thank you. A rather difficult question, or difficult to come up with a solution. Are there any means or efforts to address student retaliation against faculty members via student evaluations, ratings, and/or comments, anything along those lines?
I assume this question is talking about the SRTE process by which students provide assessments at the end of a course on the course itself and the faculty member and other academic staff who've supported the delivery of that course. The good news about SRTEs, while an individual faculty member may feel some negative comments that are really acutely personal or not pleasant, the SRTEs are not broadly publicly available. So I think most faculty do not need to be concerned about those types of comments or allegations being made public. There are, of course, in 2018, many other means by which students could say things about faculty members or other members of the institution that are inappropriate or distasteful. I think to the extent that we're able, protecting the right of free speech among our student body, we try to work through the Office of Student Affairs to appropriately counsel students against really inappropriate conduct using social media or other channels, and we've had a number of instances of that, as I think many of you know.
Speaking of students, and that was one of the findings of the survey, is that a lot of this is going on off campus. This is a faculty staff town hall, but it's a matter of concern for the people in the audience. What can be done? And you talked about maybe taking different steps in the future. How can an entity like Penn State police something that is going on beyond its borders?
Well, there's a great relationship between our University Police and Public Safety Department and our surrounding municipal jurisdiction police departments, the Borough of State College, Ferguson Township, Patton Township, and so forth. There is ongoing dialogue among those, between and among those police leaders, and there's considerable sharing of resources and intelligence, and we have, I think, a terrific town-gown relationship, most prominently with the Borough of State College, whereby our police officers from both of those departments really work seamlessly with one another. You'll oftentimes, when the academic year is in session, you'll see university police working side by side with the Borough of State College police to patrol the downtown areas and the neighborhoods. Again, recognizing that we're all in this together here to try and really uphold the well-being of our larger community.
Couple of years ago, several years ago, President Barron commissioned a task force to look at sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. That task force developed a set of recommendations, all of which were embraced by the President, and a process to implement those recommendations was taken. 16 months ago, there was a tragedy here on this campus associated with the death of Tim Piazza at a fraternity, as you're all aware. This was another particularly challenging moment that I think indicated the extent of some of the misconduct and inappropriate behavior that was happening technically off campus, but obviously broadly associated with the university. And I would like to think that all of you who are participating have seen again President Barron's leadership and the leadership of Penn State in taking on what is not only a local problem or a local challenge here in State College, but more generally one that has a national component. And Penn State has tried to, I think, to the extent that we're able, and really as a tribute to Tim Piazza, to really turn this around and effect change not only locally but also on a national level in the Greek space. And I think we've really been quite successful. So this is an institution that is absolutely committed, even though this is a difficult and challenging problem, to effect change in this space among our undergraduate students.
You've mentioned rolling out survey results to other campuses and specific colleges. As this person noted, that there's a very different environment here versus someone across the state. When can they expect those, and what will they look like? When can they hear from you?
Sure. So we've already begun dissemination of some reports, as David mentioned. They'll be coming out over the summer and into the early part of the fall, and I will be meeting with leadership through that period as well to help explain the results, look at what the strengths and weaknesses are. And some campuses, actually a few that I've already worked with that have their results, are moving forward and quickly. And they had actually requested that if they could be put to the top of the line, or top of the list, so that they could continue some of the initiatives that they had. So I would say, generally, long story short, by the end of the fall, certainly, everybody should have their reports and have had a conversation with me.
And where can someone view the full results of both this survey and the previous version?
So our university ethics website, universityethics.psu.edu. On the right-hand side, there's a Values and Culture tab. Click that, and that will take you to a number of our initiatives, including the Values and Culture Survey. We have a lot of information, not only the summary of the survey, but also all the data tables, which protects anonymity. It's just for faculty, staff, undergraduates, and graduates university-wide on all of the questions. So we want to be as transparent as possible with that. We also include the initiatives that follow up from the survey. We try to keep that up to date as well to keep everyone informed.
And when will the next survey be, and should people look to see any changes in any of the questioning or anything they should be looking for?
I don't think we've completely decided, but I do think we have seen and derived a great deal of value from this undertaking. And so it was roughly 4 years, Tim, from the original survey in the fall of 13 to the one that was administered last fall. And I would think perhaps every 4 years is an appropriate interval, 3 or 4 years. I don't think we'd want to go too much longer than that. So it would be my hope and expectation that probably around 2021 we'd be looking to undertake another iteration of this survey.
That's about all the time we have for, so we'd like to ask you to just sum up if there's anything you'd like to say, if maybe one more time reiterate those resources for people, because we've had questions come in, again, where can I report bullying? Where can I report this? So if there's some way to encapsulate that, if you could do that for our audience.
We've tried to create, if you will, a one-stop shop at reporting.psu.edu, and that lists all of our reporting resources. We're currently in the process of redesigning it so it's a little more user-friendly, where you just click a button and it takes you to the appropriate place. But in the interim, that's one place certainly that you can go to. The other is always hotline.psu.edu. That takes you to the portal for the hotline.
Dave, great.
I would just, I would hope that folks would draw from this session this afternoon the ongoing staunch commitment of university leadership to this ongoing challenge. We recognize that this is something that is it's a journey that we're on, that it will take us some time, but that we are absolutely committed to building the fabric of a community that's predicated on trust and great, respectful, open communications, and that we will not rest until that has been achieved. And as Tim suggested earlier, until we drive down that sense of people that feel as though they're victims of misconduct to very, very low levels, certainly lower than where we see them today. So I would hope that folks would understand that there's just very, very strong and durable commitment to the university's continual progress. And I would also suggest that I think the evidence shows that we are seeing the signs of that, and that we're encouraged by that, and that we only intend to stay the course.
If you see something, say something. And I really learned this in my previous position before I was at Penn State, where I had to deal with a particularly egregious case of misconduct, and I was baffled that it was so obvious, but why had nobody brought this to my attention before this everything kind of blew up? So I actually went and spoke to a number of people and said, why didn't you tell me? And they looked at me and said, because we thought you knew. And we thought you knew, and you weren't taking any action, so there was no point in bringing it up, because what was the point? And then I explained, well, I didn't know. And I think this is a trap that a lot of people can fall into, a presumption that people above you, up to and including us, know what's going on, and somehow we are choosing not to act. Invariably, that is not the case. So if you see something, say something. I can assure you we will investigate. We take these reports very seriously, and we wrestle them all to the ground, and we will take action both to address the issue once we've completed the investigation, and to ensure that you as a reporter are protected against any form of retaliation. It is very important that you understand our commitment to protecting the integrity of this process, and that includes protecting your integrity, that includes protecting you if you have the courage to come forward and make a report. So thank you all for listening to us.
I'd like to thank everyone who attended both in person and online and asked questions. I'd like to especially thank the three of you for answering those questions today. Please, if you could help us out, take a minute to fill out a survey that we've posted again at liveevents.psu.edu. There you can tell us if there's anything that we could improve upon this situation and these town halls, and tell us what topics you'd like to see covered in the future. That's really the best way for us to collectively address the concerns that you have, is to tell us what they are, and then we can bring together forums like this and discuss those issues. If we didn't get to your question this afternoon, please send us an email to questions@psu.edu, and we will make every effort to follow up. Thank you again, and thank you, gentlemen, for answering the questions, and have a good evening.